All right, so now I'm just going to do the intro again, and we'll just keep going as long as you got enough time, because honestly, it's going to be another hour or something. If you're okay.
Yeah, it's a Friday afternoon.
Welcome, FC Dallas curious fans, to the next edition. I guess we're now actually up to episode 57. This is part 2 of our look back through the history of the Dallas burn phase of the FC Dallas. With me again, just this last episode, is Dustin Christmann, the El Jefe, the founder of the Inferno, first fan as we call him. He has been around this franchise and a fan of this franchise forever. And if you joined us for the first half of this conversation, we are now up to the year 2000. Dustin, thanks for coming back with me again for the second half of this, what is essentially going to be a 3-hour podcast to cut into 2 pieces.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, so for 2000... for the most part, the era of allocations is over. The burn draft, Antonio Chivas Martinez, great nickname, and Alexi Carroll. Alexi, by the way, might be one of the most promising picks they've ever made that ended up going nowhere. But that really is about it for changes. Paul Broom becomes your full-time starter. Ted Eck becomes basically your full-time holding mid. But most importantly, and perhaps the worst thing that happens, is Ricardo Iribarren wears the number 10 as a marking left back and curses the burn number 10 jersey for a decade.
Yeah, I still don't know what was up with that, because I was sitting there saying, wait a minute, our number 10 is a defender, but which was actually kind of ironic for that season, because what I remember most from that season is the Burns scored a lot of goals, but they gave up a lot of goals. They gave up a lot of goals. And the only reason why that season wasn't as bad as, 98 in terms of how people remember it is the whole, we scored a lot of goals part of it.
Well, the jersey thing specifically caused a change in the way the club functioned. Prior to that, jersey numbers were handed out by the equipment manager, Kevin Harder. And once he allowed Ricardo Iribarren to wear number 10, our good friend Bobby Hammond put his foot down and took over the handing out of jersey numbers and made sure that kind of garbage never happened again.
Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you, Bobby Hammond. All right. So, unfortunately, Dustin, the most memorable game of 2000 is a bad one, and that's the Clinton Mathis.
I already know which one. Yep.
The Clinton Mathis 5-goal game. People forget, actually, that it was a 6-4 game. So for most of the game, it was really entertaining. I mean, lots of goal scoring and back and forth. But I remember just losing my absolute mind watching it, because a lot of Clint's action was like pick the ball up at midfield and dribble like 50 yards. And I thought, where the hell are the central midfielders? Why are we not closing that crap down? The guy just was, it's one of the craziest hot performances I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, it was like if Maradona's, run through the entire England team goal from World Cup '86. That game was like if you had split it up into a couple or 3 different parts, and that's what Clint Mathis basically did to the Burn. Because as you remember, it was you look back on that game and it said, wow, good, the Burn scored 4 goals, they won, right? Well, no, nope. Not so much, because the list of games where you score 4 goals and you lose is a pretty short one, and the list of games where you score 4 goals and you lose by multiple goals is even shorter. And what I remember from that game is the Burn actually had a lead at some point, at one point, and then that's when the Clint Mathis show started. And as he said, the guy was basically going through the team like hot knife through butter, and it was like, what the hell is going on here? And it was not just like he was, scoring some really fabulous goals and well, what can you do? No, he was he was getting the ball with nobody around, and then dribbling for a piece, and then well, it's him and Matt Jordan and maybe a special guest defender, and he gets, and of course he's going to put that away because he's Clint Mathis, and so that was a truly that game more than any other game pretty much epitomized the 2000 season, because the Burns scored a lot of goals, but they gave up a lot of goals. And if I remember correctly, they had a pretty decent record that year. They might have been almost exactly 500.
Yes, they were.
That year, because that year they brought back, they got rid of the shootout and brought back draws after overtime. And which, I still like. And they, but they had a negative goal differential, if I remember correctly, because they gave up so many goals.
It was actually zero.
It was a 0 goal differential?
Yeah, they scored 54 and gave up 54.
Wow, perfectly 500 season.
Yeah, 54 is a lot of goals allowed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if the FCD gives up 54 goals, this season, well, assuming there is a this season,
right,
or next season, then I think a lot of people are going to be calling for Lucci's head.
Well, as you mentioned, the main thing that this could be said of the Burn that season was that Graziani and Kreis were clicking, because Graziani led the team with 15 goals and Kreis had 11 goals and 13 assists. And honestly, as you mentioned before, at the end of the 1999 season, is the 2000 season with Graziani and Kreis. Honestly, that's the hottest and most deadly single season duo that I can remember in club franchise history. It was ridiculous how good those guys were playing together and scoring goals.
Oh yeah, and it was. I mean, and the thing about it is, I think Graziani might have been a little bit underappreciated here in Dallas, largely because he was Ariel Graziani. I mean,
that's amazing.
And he started off so hot, and people said, "Oh yeah, this guy's going to be scoring like 20 or 30 goals for us next season." Well, he only got 15. I mean, we would kill somebody for a 15-goal scorer these days.
I know.
I mean, if somebody scores 10 goals for FCD this year or next year or any other year, we're going to be wanting to build a statue to the guy. Yeah. And the guy scores 15 goals, and all anybody can focus on is that the guy is a very flamboyant player. He dives a bit. He sells the fouls. Which basically you would expect out of any high level professional.
Do you remember the game Graziani got subbed out? I think it was 2000, where he took a chair and went down to the end of the Cotton Bowl and sat in a chair down at the touchline by himself.
No, I don't. I remember the goal the following year, where the game the following year where he got subbed out and he went straight to the dressing room.
Yeah.
He did not even want to sit on the bench.
I've told stories too about the time he got thrown out of training by a coach. I can't remember which coach it was, but he got sent to the showers out of training once or twice too. So, the guy was hard to coach, but a lot of times great players are hard to coach. So it's part of the.
I mean, everybody likes to think that you want to treat every player or every worker or whatever the same. And I might have this point of view because I've often in my own professional career been kind of a management challenge. But I think, you gotta work, you gotta meet some players halfway. I mean, if the guy's getting the results for you, then, if some guy at the end of the bench he wants to be a jackass, then you can be a hard ass to him. But if the guy is knocking in 15 goals, then you might extend him a little bit of latitude and say, you know what, when you start scoring 15 goals, you can start becoming a coaching headache too.
Yeah, right. Well, as you said, the Burn finished 500 that year and finished third place in the Central Conference. The first season of of 3 conferences. Honestly, Dustin, that made for a very bizarre circumstances that Central Conference was only lasted for 2 seasons.
Well, yeah, and they changed up the playoffs, so they took the top 8 teams, irrespective of conference, and so I think the Burn got the Metro Stars, and in that opening round.
Well, they got stomped by the Metro Stars, yeah.
If I remember correctly, that first game up at Giant Stadium was the Burn were doing okay, and then all of a sudden they give up a late goal or two, and then they come out that game down 3 points to none, because that's the way they were doing playoff. They were still doing 3-game series, but they was figuring out, okay, we're going to be doing points instead of games because we're going to allow for draws.
Right.
And then they come back to the Cotton Bowl, and then the Metro Stars proceed to have their way with the.
Well, Clint Mathis did.
Well,
he had a brace again.
Well, yeah, that year, Clint Mathis was. I mean, he was the Metro Stars. I mean, he was. As the Metro Stars, as Clint Mathis went the Burn, so went the Metro Stars, and so yeah, the fact, that, and it was the birth of. And didn't he win the MVP that year?
I don't remember specifically. I'd have to look it up. But he certainly had a year that season it was truly remarkable. I mean, I remember him just dominating the league that year.
And I think you and I had a sort of a disagreement at that point where I kind of minimized the guy's talent because I said, well, he made his name at the expense of the Dallas Burn, and against everyone else, he was kind of an average player. And really, I mean, is he all that good? Because at that point everybody was having good games against the Burn, and so why should we be hoisting this guy up? Just because he did it, more so than all these other guys who were having good games. And then you, if I remember, were insisting, probably correctly, that no, he actually was a good player, and so. I think ultimately you were proven more correct on that than I was because, hey, he's part of that 2002 World Cup team that did so well in Korea. I kind of abandoned that theory after the 2002 World Cup.
Well, he was always a little out of shape and probably partied way too much. He's like Carlos Ruiz in that aspect, that if he had partied a lot less and worked a little harder, he might have been a U.S. player for the ages. But I certainly think the guy had talent. There's no question about that.
I thought you were going to say George Best.
Yeah, that's another example.
Which is literally the only time you're ever going to hear George Best and Clint Mathis in the same sentence.
Yeah, George Best definitely drank himself out of a good chunk of his career, but I believe Carlos Ruiz did too. So. Anyway, that kind of puts a bow on the year 2000. By the way, Mathis was just best 11 that year. I just looked it up. It was not MVP,
really?
But certainly it was.
Who was MVP?
Well, I only looked up Mathis. I didn't look up the season.
I'm using you as my. I'm sitting here in front of a computer. I could look it up too. But,
yeah.
I'd rather have you do the work.
All right, well, 2000 MLS MVP. Let's go. Here we go. Tony Meola. Wow.
Oh, yeah, because the Wizards, I remember that year because nobody scored on the Wizards, and, they went to the MLS Cup and won.
All right.
So, I think that'd probably be the only time in league history that a goalkeeper has ever won MVP.
I'd have to look that up too. Let's see, Kansas City.
Yeah, you would have to look that up, but I'm gonna assume that I'm correct on that.
They only allowed 29 goals. Kansas City did that year. They had a plus 19 goal differential, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and they had Miklos Molnar that year.
All right, let's move on to 2001. The biggest loss or biggest cost of 2000 was the end of Dave Durr's coaching tenure in Dallas, and the club changed over to coach Mike Jeffries. Putting aside what happened eventually, what do you remember back to what your thoughts were on Jeffries being named coach?
Well, you know what, my whole feelings around that situation have they've evolved a bit over the years. At the time, I thought, well, you know what, Dave Durr had his shot, and it was time. It was time for a change. And I thought that Mike Jeffries, he came from the Chicago Fire, which had been probably the dominant team of probably the first half of the aughts. What was going to be the first half of the aughts. This was still the end of 2000 at that point. And, he was you're going under the assumption that, well, Bob Bradley, he's a good coach. He's probably not going to be hiring any sort of dummy as his second in command. And Mike Jeffries is no dummy. So I figured, this is going to be a really great hire, and he's going to be the hire that leads the Burn to bigger and better things. Now, like I said, my thinking on that has evolved a bit over the years, and this has been largely informed by what happened a couple years later. But I think that probably Mike Jeffries is probably one of those coaches. He's a good coach, but I don't know if I think he might belong to that category of good coach that is a good second in command rather than a good first head guy.
That's probably a fair take.
Yeah, I mean, because you see all these really, in all sorts of sports, you see all these really great assistant coaches. They get they get a head job and they fall. I don't want to say fall flat on their face, but they certainly don't impress as much as they did when they were an assistant. And so Mike Jeffries, I mean, he was a good coach, but I think ultimately, I think in a league where the talent differential between teams is as close as you find in MLS, I think coaching is what is a huge difference that you can have between teams. And if you don't have a really great coach, if you don't have even a good coach, then you're going to eventually be found out, because all those other teams are paying good money to their coaches too.
Yeah.
And they're gonna figure you out. And so, and I think that even if you don't have the horses, you can still be a leader of men, and you can still, get your team to play above themselves for a number of games and cobble together and figure out a way to cobble together results. And sadly, I don't think that Mike Jeffries was necessarily that guy. And the last thing I will say on his predecessor is that I think that what Dave Durr did as head coach of this team is probably, in retrospect, far more underappreciated than it should be, because people say, "Oh yeah, 8 out of 10 teams make the playoffs every year. How tough is it to make the playoffs?" So big deal that he made the playoffs every single year he was head coach. Well, at the time that he was let go, there were a grand total of 2 teams out of 10 that had made the playoffs every year: the Burn and the LA Galaxy. And so anybody who wants to minimize the fact that they made the playoffs every year under Durr, anybody who wants to minimize that, well, just look at who else did it. Well, it was the Galaxy. And what did they do? They were on their third coach at that point. So,
right.
I don't want to hear anything about how all he did was make the playoffs when 80% of the league made the playoffs. Well, there was only one other team that did that too.
Right. Well, the 2 things I'll say about Jeffries is that the first time I ever met him was at his press conference when he was hired, and he asked me to stop putting the lineup in the practice observations, because he said when he was in Chicago they would read them and get like a scouting report on the team. And the second thing about him that has made him really unique is that because he had won the Herman Trophy in college, when in training, when they were short on personnel, when they needed an extra person, or they needed to even the numbers up, he would participate in training. He would do not the drills, but he would do the scrimmages and the short-sided things and stuff like that, as he fancies himself a player still on some level of his head. And the thing that was crazy about that was that I believe it was in the 2003 season, which we'll talk a bunch about later. But there was a guy named Percy Oliveris that they had brought in and signed, who then never played. And there was a moment late in the season where he took the chance and put in one of the most vicious, hard red card worthy, straight crunching tackles I've ever seen on Jeffries from behind. And Jeffries didn't say squat about it. He just let it go because he knew the guy was way past his point of no return with the team, was never going to play anyway. So those two things were what made Jeffries pretty unique. Both his recognition of me and who I was, and then also just the idea that he would participate in drills.
Yeah.
So 2001, if we can move on with that season, the Burn drafted Joselito Vaca, nicknamed Little Joe Cal, by the way, one of my favorites of all time. And they drafted Eddie Johnson, and they drafted a potential, possible, almost Rookie of the Year Ryan Suarez.
Oh, man. Ryan Suarez. I mean, first of all, Little Joe Cal. Didn't Pete come up with that nickname?
No, I did, but yeah.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of my favorites.
And an amazing amount of this team's histories comes from third-degree contributors.
Of which you are one, by the way. Don't sell yourself short.
Well,
yeah.
I
back in the day,
give a few bucks. I give a few bucks to the Patreon now, and back in the day, I wrote a few words, but I'm not going to oversell myself either.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ryan Suarez, God. You know what? I wrote a little bit about him for the ranking of the top 5 right backs, and man, what could have been with that guy?
Right.
I mean, because the guy had talent. He was a two-way threat. He had size. He had speed. The problem is that he was one of those guys where you'd say $1 million talent, Pinsent head, because
Luke Lelouch.
because he more than anybody else that I can think of in this team's history really needed somebody to settle him down and say, hey, calm down. You don't have to, win every single 50-50, or you don't have to win a 50-50 at the expense of a yellow card. You don't have to, tell the referee exactly what you think of that last call. And he apparently, the thing about it was he was really. And he was a good guy too. I mean, you talk with him, and he was a good guy. But on the field, he was a little bit of a wild man, and that was probably the biggest undoing of his career, because he had talent going both ways, and it's kind of tragic. Little Joe Cal. I mean, the thing I remember about him is that he came to this team with all sorts of plaudits coming in, and he was a good he was a good player, but I don't think he ever lived up to what the hype beforehand would have led you to believe what was in store for him.
He was out of Taichi, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, and he was, really highly regarded player out of Taichi. But the thing that he had that really hurt him was the fact that, well, he was not a very big guy at all. And a lot of not so big guys do well in this game, even when they're surrounded by, and getting crunched by a lot of smaller guys in this game play bigger than their size. Well, one of whom is Oscar Pereira.
Right.
Oscar Pereira, not a terribly big guy, but he played bigger than his size. The problem with Vaca is he was, too. I really hate to say too small to play this game, but he just didn't have what it took to play bigger than what he actually was. And so while he was good, he was competent, I don't think I think the fact that he really could not step up to a high level professional um, league is probably what doomed him, because it was a step up from where he came from. I mean, you can be the hottest stuff in youth soccer, and even a really high level youth setup like Taoichi, or you can be the hottest stuff coming from one of the lower. And a lot of people say, "Oh, MLS, that's a really crappy league." Well, MLS is still probably, even in those days, was still probably in the top 20% leagues, 20% of the leagues in the world. And you had guys who were at least professional, and by that point in time, where it was a professional enough league that you had guys that were not just crunchers, but they could also contribute a little bit on going forward as well. So he was going up against guys who would crunch him, but they it wasn't like he was going up against donkeys and couldn't survive. He was going up against good players who would crunch him, and he couldn't survive.
Yeah. Well, going back to Ryan Suarez for a minute, he's one of my favorite burn players of all time, and that was before he came to me and volunteered to write something for us. And he wrote for a short time a column for us, which of course the team was not particularly happy about, but I thoroughly enjoyed the inside look into what they were doing. And as you mentioned with Joselito, they put a lot of weight on him. My memory is that basically they used him as a 10 behind in a 3-5-2 with Graziani and Kreis up top and Diego Pareja behind him. So he's basically driving the bus as a kid that just got drafted. Now he was a league signing that got drafted. It was how they did it back then sometimes. And over the years, he's got, according to Wikipedia, 56 caps for Bolivia and played in 2 Copa Americas. So the kid had talent. It's just, I think that you're right that they just gave him a lot of weight early on with the club in terms of where they use him in the formation. And it just was a little too much for him at that time. And perhaps the MLS being a big, giant physical league with these big defenders, it was just, as you say, he was just a little bit small. It wasn't just that he was short. He was also very skinny too.
Yeah. And he's the sort of player that, if only North Texas SC had been around at that point. I mean, because he would have been a tremendous player to have, because they could have given him, a season or two there, get him used to the, American, players in a professional setting. And that way, when he's playing with the first team, he's more, in step with the way things are at a professional level in this country.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about an era of Major League Soccer where they didn't even have full teams of players. Like first round picks were walked into the team and started. There was no development back then.
Oh, no. Yeah. And, is when, people, like to foolishly say, in my opinion, that the draft is irrelevant these days. I'd say you look at the FCD's roster and today, and you can see draftees playing significant minutes. But yeah, in those days, I mean, if you're a number one draft pick, you better be on the field,
ready to start.
Ready to start. And we can be thankful that Paxton Pomykal is not 15 years older than he is, because I guarantee you that he would have ended up playing the same role that Joselito Vaca would have if he had been around at that time. I mean, with the talent that he has, of course he would have been he would have been on the field
Paxton,
even before he needed to be on the field.
Paxton probably would have ended up like Jonathan Villanueva. If you remember him, he came out of the Dallas Texans when they won the national championship. Mm-hmm. And then back then, your only choice was college. He went to Virginia, who didn't play the kind of Latin style that Dallas Texans did, and he just sort of floundered and never did anything. So it's like Paxton would likely be in that kind of, he's not Latin, but he wouldn't be in that exact kind of situation if he was 10, 15 years older when, there really were no homegrowns. Even Ramon Nunez had to go to college, and we're still talking about a year that's 5 years from when Ramon Nunez came in.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing that people, and another thing that people don't appreciate is how different it is being a professional from being a really great youth player, even from other countries like you're coming up through Taoichi. Yeah, it's one of the best youth systems in the world, but at the end of the day, it is still youth and not professional. Where somebody once said, look, it's a completely different story when you get signed to a professional contract and you got some cigarette puffing manager who's who's seen literally every player coming through the system, and you're just another piece of raw meat to them. And you're not the hottest thing on earth anymore. You are just another piece of meat by some guy who cares nothing about your development. He gets paid, and he will get fired or not get fired based on wins and losses. So you better be ready to, go and be a professional whenever you are in the lineup.
Well, unfortunately, Dustin, 2001 is perhaps most remarkable for, again, our good friend Clint Mathis scoring what is the goal of the year at Dallas in I believe it's about the 5th game of the year. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but it was a 60-yard weaving, running slalom, even more so than what Maradona did against England. And once again, Clint Mathis killing the burn.
Yep. And yeah, he was probably, if the Colorado Rapids are as a team are the burn killer and the SCD killer, he was the individual more than any other who caused so much heartache to this fan base, because he would always find a way to score against this team.
It was painful.
It was in the most painful ways possible. Even when he was in LA, if I remember correctly, he got a few goals against.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and the other thing I remember from that year is I remember Christos Stoichkov for the Fire just absolutely making the burn look foolish on a few occasions. He made a lot of people look foolish, but he made the burn look foolish on a few occasions. And shockingly, I think one of those occasions was when the burn faced Chicago in the playoffs that year.
I'd have to look that up. Risto Stoichkov is one of my favorite players of all time. I, in fact, have a picture of him scoring for Bulgaria against Argentina at the Cotton Bowl in the World Cup. A picture I took from my own phone.
Oh, he belongs to my rogues gallery.
Yeah.
I hate the guy. I see the guy now on Univision, and I immediately want to switch the channel.
I don't blame you.
Because I've been trying to learn Spanish, and so I can understand about 20% of what comes out of the people's mouths on Univision. Mm-hmm. And whenever he says something, I don't understand it, but I'm convinced that it's already bullshit. Just because it's coming out of his mouth.
Yeah, hater's gonna hate, right?
Exactly. I'm a Christo hater.
Yeah. Well, 2001 obviously is the 9/11 season, and obviously the back end of the season was truncated by 9/11. The Burn only played 26 games, shortened the season.
We really can't identify with that sort of thing.
I know. That's one of the things I've talked about right away with this current season was, okay, we've shortened the season before. I in the context of everything else that went on around 9/11, it's hard to remember much about the context with the Burn other than the league initially took like a 2-week, okay, stop, we're going to cancel games, and then they ended up canceling the whole season.
Well, it was the final 2 weeks of the season.
Is that all it was?
And then, yeah. So, and then they, and I think at that point it was people had played mostly. It was a 28 game season, and I think most everyone had played at 26. Yeah. But there was like one or two teams that had played 25 and 27. You know how it goes.
Yeah, some of them were on 27. Yeah.
Yeah, so they just said, okay, we're going to just finish the season and go straight into the playoffs, and they seeded based on points per game, which is how the Burn had fewer points than the Wizards, but ended up being in the playoffs ahead of the Wizards, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they definitely got in. I remember that they got in with less points because it was the points per game scenario. I didn't remember that it was Kansas City, but as you say that sounds familiar in my head. It made for a very surreal sort of playoff structure, and I do know that once again they got to face the Chicago Fire, as you mentioned, in the playoffs. It was not a good series for the Burn. They got stomped 0-2 in Chicago, and then they tied at home to force Game 3. And as you said, because back then it was the points structure. We were dealing with 3 conferences also, which complicated matters. And they ended up losing again in Game 3 up in Chicago. So effectively, you were looking at a loss. That is an exceedingly painful 3-game set by your Dallas Burn at the time.
Yeah, you know what? And that was the last we ever saw of the Tampa Bay Mutiny as well.
Yes.
Because when they were probably that year they were one of the worst teams in league history. So obviously they didn't make the playoffs. And then when 9/11 happened, that was the end of their season, and as it turned out, the end of their existence.
And the Miami Fusion that year were fantastic. One of the best teams we've ever seen.
They were the Supporter Shield winners.
Yeah.
Forever cemented Ray Hudson's legacy in American soccer lore.
Well, if one were into soccer on a more national scene, that 2001 Miami team is honestly probably worth an hour-long podcast just by itself, because that team was absolutely phenomenal. Not that we need to get into it here, but it was a truly remarkable team.
And we talked about how cheaply the Hunts run FC Dallas. But oh my God, the stories you hear about how things went in Miami that final year, where they didn't even have things like ice for practices, because players need to ice down things at the end of practice, whether they're injured or just for whatever reason. They didn't even they had to go out and get ice from the local 7-Eleven or whatever. They didn't have an ice machine there. And they in every single way, they were probably run more cheaply that year than, according to the stories that I read, than the Burn were run in their league run days. Yeah. I mean, not that the league spent a whole lot of money on the Burn in those years, but they ran it to a higher degree of professionalism than the Fusion were run in that final year. That year was probably the most surreal year of Major League Soccer that I can remember. Well, up until this year.
Up until this year, yeah. Well, that brings us to 2002 and contraction. The Central Conference vanishes. Miami's the best team in the league, and they get contracted because the rest of the owners could not wait to get rid of that guy. But the other important story is that Tampa Bay was contracted instead of FC Dallas. Now, we've learned together in hindsight, all of us collectively, I think, that effectively, and we didn't know this at the time, effectively the Hunts saved FC Dallas over Tampa being contracted, because the Hunts were already secretly talking to McKinney and thought they could get a deal done in McKinney. Now, subsequently, that deal fell apart and we ended up in Frisco, but I think we should never forget that the Hunts effectively saved this franchise, and we would not have a team here if they hadn't been willing to take on the club, even though it wasn't official for several months after that.
Yeah, well, and let me add to that the fact that Miami was contracted and not the San Jose Clash, because at that point the Clash were taken over by by Anschutz. The AEG, according to the stories I read, said that they went to Horowitz and said, "Hey, we'll take over the Fusion,"
Mm-hmm.
And Horowitz was like, "No," and Tampa and San Jose won the league championship that year, so those two things combined probably saved the Earthquakes, because they were the Earthquakes as of 2000. That saved the Earthquakes instead of the Fusion. Both of the Earthquakes and the Burn were saved by the hairs of their chinny chin chins.
Wow, what a different world the league would be in, right?
Yeah, and so the whole thing around McKinney, um, I mean, it was wild because all of a sudden one day you wake up and you hear that McKinney and wants to build a stadium for the Burn. And so I remember going to some of those city council meetings and supporting the team and all that. And they eventually passed the funding for McKinney, and then they pulled out. And this what I've heard since then is that it was no big deal to the Hunts that McKinney pulled out, because they were already, because Collin County was definitely on board. And so if McKinney didn't happen, then they had Frisco in their back pocket.
Right.
And so, I was there at this city council meetings in McKinney, and, I thought this team was going to be saved when the vote, and they voted to fund it. And then I thought, oh God, we're dead when they pulled out. And then when Frisco happened, I was already once bitten. So I was not like, okay, well, I'm not getting too excited until there's shovels in the ground. And that all of a sudden happened. All of this McKinney, Frisco, it all happened within a few months, if I remember correctly. I mean, it was just like a whirlwind.
Yeah, it was a whirlwind. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing about it is that the Burn got a better deal by McKinney pulling out than they would have gotten.
Probably.
Because if I remember correctly, it was just the city of McKinney putting in a certain number of dollars, like $30 million. It wasn't very much. And then the Hunts would have been on the hook for the rest, which, means that, it was going to be more or less, Crew Stadium 2.0.
Right.
So, and whereas in Frisco, you had the city putting in some money, you had the county putting in some money, and then you had Frisco ISD putting in some of the money. So, they were able to do a much better stadium in Frisco than they probably would have ended up with in McKinney. So, I remember being at the meeting in Frisco where they approved this, and first of all, it was a much more low-key affair, and at that time, because I remember when I moved to Dallas after college in '94, Frisco was a 2-horse cow town. I mean, it was. It was just a couple thousand people. It was a wide spot on Preston Road, and here we are, not even a decade later, and they're going to be spending literally tens of millions of dollars on a stadium for the little old Dallas Burn. As it was surreal, and at that point they were already well on their exponential growth. That what are they now, 150,000 people? But
something crazy.
But at that point, they were already on the upslope, and they definitely wanted to attract a lot of those dollars for the residents who were moving in. So smartly, I might also add, but I'm a little bit biased on that point because they saved my team.
You're right. Well, speaking of your team, 2002, Jeffrey starts to rebuild the team a bit. They draft Chris Bondi, number 1 overall, despite the fact he blew his knee out in college. Ariel Graziani leaves and Ronald Cerritos comes in. Steve Morrow is brought in to replace Lubus Kubik, who only played 11 games for a very short stint in Dallas. And they also brought in Tim Obansu because they were basically shifting to a 4-4-2 and needed 2 center backs. And perhaps my favorite story of the spring was that the Burn drafted Josh Keller out of the dispersal draft. He'd been a mutiny player. And he came to Dallas and was here for a week, maybe 2 weeks training, and then ups and retires because he didn't like how damn hot it was basically in Dallas and gave up on his playing career. So the rebuild was well underway, but perhaps the biggest addition that year, and I don't know if you'll agree with me on this one, was the addition of Time Magazine's Man of the Century, Ronnie O'Brien. And I'll tell that story if you don't remember it.
Yes. I remember those stories.
Yeah.
There. I don't know. I can't remember if this sort of it would have been in 2000 when this would have happened. So it was the internet. It was before Time Warner had a clue about the hijinks that people on the internet could do.
Right.
So so Ronnie O'Brien. Oh my God. He would if there's a Mount Rushmore, a second team Mount Rushmore for this team, he's definitely on it.
Yeah.
Because the guy. Yeah, obviously, I would agree that he was the most important acquisition of that year because, you look at, by process of elimination, is he more important than Lubo Skubic? Absolutely.
Yeah.
More than Ronald Cerritos? I could, in the right circumstances, I could almost forget that Ronald Cerritos was with this team.
Right.
Even though he actually had a couple of years with the team. Chris Bondi and
Temwa Bonsu and Steve Morrow.
Temwa Bonsu, Steve Morrow. He was. I liked him as a player because he was, again, one of these professional players that came up through a real big boy league, and it was. Unfortunately, he's best remembered for having his arm broken in a goal celebration.
It was the FA Cup, wasn't it? I think.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And he played for Arsenal, but no one's perfect. Didn't he play for Arsenal?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no one's perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah, he added a lot of professionalism to this team, and then you have and then Ronnie O'Brien. He was, I love that guy.
One of my favorite Ronnie stories was that he showed up in training camp at Burn training camp in the middle of the season, and we were like, "Who's this guy?" And the coaching staff actually asked us not to report on who he was because he was a Juventus player, if you remember, and Juventus was adamant to the Burn. It says if this gets out in the media, the deal's off because they knew. With this whole Man of the Century stuff or whatever, that Ronnie had this big, huge following. And so they said, if it gets out, the deal's off. And so we had to actually be quiet about it, which is one of the strangest moments in terms of reporting. But the very first game training I was ever at, where Ronnie showed up, I was standing next to Tobias Lopez. And the ball comes over sort of right in front of us, right, and we're near midfield of this scrimmage that's happening. And Ronnie turns and rips a 40-yard shot from like 5 yards in front of us into like the back post upper 90. And he starts screaming, "That one's not coming back," at everybody else on the field, basically. And that kind of over the top moment, that kind of over the top, like, here I am, everybody. That's exactly the kind of personality he was.
Yeah. And he was, the thing about Ronnie O'Brien is that he provided a lot of wit to the team that it otherwise, would not. Because who were the two wingers from the 2001 season?
Jesus, Antonio Martinez and goodness, keep talking. I'll look.
Well, and the thing about it, the thing about it is he played well on both. He played well going both ways, which I think really helped solidify the defense because the defense was so much better in 2002 than it was in 2001, which is the reason why the team was much better.
01's the 3-5-2 with Broom on the left and Richard Ferrer on the right.
Yeah, and I love Richard Ferrer, but an outside back or outside mid, he is not. But he was really Ronnie O'Brien was really great going both ways, and so you combine his good two-way play with the addition of Bonsu and Morrow at center back, and it's little wonder that they were so much more solid defensively than they were in the previous two seasons. And he also, he was also very, very effective heading forward. And I think when he got in, I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit here. When he got injured in 2003, I mean that was a huge reason why the team performed so badly.
Yeah, it was. All right, where am I? I lost track. All right.
Well, in 2002.
Yeah. All right. So honestly, the 2002 is a pretty good season for Jeffries. The team's moving in the right direction, right? They're several games above 500 that year. Deering and Suarez are both all-stars. Kreis is an all-star reserve. Vaca's the commissioner's pick. And Oscar Pareja made the best 11, and when you add in the addition of Ronnie and you add in, the quality of Jason still playing up top, you were looking at a team that was moving in the right direction and had a positive flow to it and vibe to it and a direction to it, and things were going. I certainly felt at the time, in a direction we wanted them to go. Things were looking up as far as I was concerned in 2002.
Oh yeah.
There's two games that year that notably come to mind. The first is Bobby Ryan's hat trick game on June 8th, which earned him the MLS Player of the Week. And the other is the club got its 100th win, which, strangely enough, it comes in a Brimstone Cup game against the hated Chicago Fire, which is a 3-1 win. And that's sort of a red letter scoreline, if you will, because Pareja, Kreis, and O'Brien scored against Chicago that day. So fitting 100th game scoreline.
Oh yeah. Now, what I remember about the wasn't the Ryan hat trick against Colorado?
Yes, Colorado Rapids on June 8th.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just had the opportunity to digitize my VHS recording of that game here a few weeks back, and some of those goals were pretty well taken, and this is why I say a lot of people forget that Ryan was a pretty effective attacking player before he eventually made his way back into being an outside back. I think a lot of players have had good days against Colorado in the regular season.
Regular season, yeah.
In the regular season,
yeah.
And foreshadowing, not so much in the
postseason.
Postseason, yeah. And then beating Chicago at that point, if I remember correctly, and I think I was on my way back from Korea when this happened. You said it was the 100th game in June? So I would have been on my way back from Korea.
Bobby's hat trick was in June. The Chicago game was also June 15th.
Yeah. Yep. So I was on my way back from Korea after seeing the U.S. play in the group stage of the World Cup, and I can't remember how I found out that Dallas had beaten, but they beat them in not Bridgeview, but in Naperville.
No, I got my game. Destin, I got my games crossed up. The 100th game is in August. Okay. The game in June, you're right, is at Chicago. That is also a 3-1 win. That's just not the 100th game. The 100th game is in August against Chicago here. They beat him twice 3-1 that year. So, I mean, good year for 3-1 wins.
Yes. And, and that was the year that the Fire were in their own plastic pitch, small stadium setup.
Naperville? Is that Naperville?
Yeah, that was Naperville because at that point in time, Soldier Field was was under renovation, so they had to go play in Naperville. But yeah, so all I remember that year is that, we had the Fire's number.
Yeah.
And it felt so good. It was. And I remember at some point in time, Jeff Bradley, when he was still working for ESPN, wrote something to the effect of, if the Burn ever played with the same Fire, with the same intensity that they played the Fire, they would have won a couple of championships by this point.
Shame, right?
I was like, yeah, I know. And hey, for many years, the Brimstone Cup was the only non-open cup hardware that they had. So, got that going for us.
Yeah.
My most enduring memories of the 2002 season is basically how it ended.
Right.
And that's
what you remember.
Well, it was the last thing that happened that year.
So. Go ahead.
My most that's how it ended. Is how it ended. Basically, with the Burn losing the series tiebreaker to the Colorado Rapids
again,
they lost it really quickly too. It was like the first minute of the tiebreaker. Mark Chung scores a really nice goal in the first minute of the series tiebreaker, and that was when the Rapids had Carlos Valderrama. Probably the least remembered part of Carlos Valderrama's career is when he was with the Rapids.
I've forgotten that myself. Yeah.
Yeah, because where do you think he went after contraction?
Right.
Yes, other teams get Taylor Twellman or the draft pick for Taylor Twellman and Carlos Valderrama. I can't even remember who the Burn got in that dispersal. Was it Josh Keller?
That was the Josh Keller pick, who then turned around and retired. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know if they got anyone else.
Well, they also got Jeff Cassar, who is not a terrible addition.
Well, Jeff Cassar is not a terrible addition, but the fact is that it was not a memorable addition either.
No, not memorable. No,
he was originally with the team way back when.
Right. So yeah, that game 3 was again painful. With the Rapids and playoff pain is just a tradition with this club.
And I think the Burn and FC Dallas have found new and different ways to lose to the Colorado Rapids. Every single time they've lost to the Rapids, it has been in a different fashion, in a equally heartbreaking fashion. First you get swept. Now you lose in the series tiebreaker in the first minute. Oh, now you're losing in penalty kicks. Now you're losing on an own goal in the MLS Cup final. I mean, this is how it goes with the Rapids. And so the reason why I remember how it ended is because it was the damn Rapids.
Yeah.
And yet, despite the amount of heartbreak that the Rapids have caused this team, I don't have the same purple passion for them that I have for other teams in the league, like, for example, the Fire or the Dynamo, or I'd probably say even Kansas City.
Perhaps we should, though, Dustin. Perhaps we should.
Perhaps we should. Yeah. I mean, and hell, they pushed the FCD pretty hard in 2016 for the Supporters Shield.
Yeah, they did. All right. Well, unfortunately, Dustin, this brings us to 2003, and I'm sure you know where we're going with this. The Hunts officially take over the team. Yep, and they're officially now owners.
You could do an entire podcast on that season.
You could. The Bean Counters, unfortunately, take over in a sense, and they cause what we affectionately call the South Lake debacle, where the Dallas Burn leave the Cotton Bowl and choose to go play at a high school stadium on turf, and not good turf, mind you. We're talking about that old 80s thin layer on cement, just horrific turf.
It was actually field. It was actually field turf.
I remember that. Well, it may have been early days of field turf because it was.
Yeah, it was horrible. It was like one of the first generations of field turf. So
it was like landing on cement.
Yeah, it was not the plush field turf
curved
that you get
field
that you get at say Portland. No,
well, I can only imagine. I considered it at the time to be a horrific idea. I can only imagine what your thoughts about it were.
No, I think your thoughts on it are pretty much the same because it was literally something that did not have to happen. It wasn't like the Cotton Bowl was being renovated like Soldier Field was. It was done purely for as you said, for bean counting reasons. And okay, so even within that context. Okay, you're moving to this high school stadium and for bean counting reasons. Is it close to Frisco, where you're already moving because you've already started construction on the stadium? No, it's not. Is it going to be a good stadium where you have plenty of amenities for the fans?
Nope.
Of course not. It's a high school stadium. You don't even have beer for the fans. Is it Does it have a good field? Well, as you mentioned, no.
No.
It's got probably one of the worst fields in league history since, at least since the Metro Stars or Red Bulls moved out of Giant Stadium.
It's up there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was bad. Every single metric that you could have come up with, it was a bad choice, except for one. That was that Hunt Sports Group was going to be paying less rent to the Carroll Independent School District than they would have been paying to the city of Dallas to use the Cotton Bowl. But in every single other way, it was horrible. Yep. And to compound that, every single thing that bad that could have happened that season on the field did happen. Jason Kreis did his knee that year and put him out it was a season-ending injury. But even that was overshadowed by the fact that it was like in the third game of the season, Ronnie O'Brien had his leg broken by everyone's favorite friend, everybody's favorite player, Dan Kovalenko, because he was playing in D.C. at that time, and he managed to break yet another burn player's leg.
That's got to be a MLS record, right? 2 broken legs by the same guy for one franchise.
Yeah, and so, like I said earlier, once that happened, the season just went to crap, and what would have been a team that would have struggled, but would have been respectable, just went completely south at that point. I mean, they didn't win their first game of the season until the 7th game. And there were only 28 games that year. So, 30 games that year. So we're talking literally a quarter of the season, nothing but draws and losses.
Yeah, you're talking about killing half your fan base because the Hispanics didn't come along. You ruined Jason Kreis's run in Dallas. He never really they got rid of him at the end of the year, right? It killed Jeffrey's coaching run.
He was with them for one more year.
Was he with them in 2004?
Yep. And in fact, I have the commemorative poster that they put out that year, almost telegraphing to the world that this was going to be his last year in Dallas.
Well, all but then certainly limited his ability after blowing his knee out. Honestly, I wonder if the club has ever really recovered from that, particularly in the loss of the fan base. They went from averaging something like anywhere from, depending on the season, 13 to 16K at the Cotton Bowl down to like 7K, and I don't think they've ever recovered in terms of the Hispanic market.
Well, what I will say about that is they could have recovered, but I don't think they've ever put a premium on recovering that fan base. I mean, ever in the 15 years since then. Yeah. They have not put the same premium on that as the team did back when it was a league-run team. Certainly when Billy was running the team, Billy Hicks was running the teams, and when Andy Swift was running the team, they put a lot of premium on doing a lot of grassroots marketing to really attract Hispanic fans to see the team. And then when Andy stepped down, midway through the 2003 season, I don't know, and I don't know, and I don't think Andy's ever going to say publicly whether it was forced or completely of his own free will. They turn around and hire, what's his name, Elliott.
Greg Elliott,
Greg Elliott, whose infamous opening press conference statement is "Our ethnicity is winning," and you
can buy that on a T-shirt, by the way.
Yeah, if you want, way to telegraph to the world that you're not going to do the same things that to get Hispanic fans to come out to the games that you were doing 2 short years ago. And so I don't think it's ever recovered, largely because I don't think the ownership has ever really put a premium on recovering it. Now, I'm sure they would never, say that, no, we intentionally jettisoned the Hispanic fan base of this team, but I don't think they've. At the same time, I don't think they've really viewed it as important as previous managements did, and I think that's a real shame because Dallas is a multi-ethnic soccer town. I mean, we see that every year.
Yep.
When El Tri comes to town, when the Dallas Cup is running, and whenever the women's national team plays in Frisco. But FCD is the only one that can't seem to get good crowds. I mean, hell, Atlanta gets monster crowds for every single game. You're telling me that Dallas cannot? Come on now.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is that, I mean, we've got this large set of people in town who will turn out, who will pay really exorbitant prices to see high-level soccer. Because let me tell you, they're not giving away those tickets to see El Tri play over at Jerry World. They're not giving those tickets away. They're charging good money for that, and they'll pay that good money. They'll sit on I-30 for however long to go to Jerry World, and you're telling me they will not sit on the Dallas North Tollway, a few times a season to go up to see FC Dallas for a lot less money to what? No, come on. I mean, get out of here. I mean, like I said, the ownership has never put a premium on attracting those fans back, so they haven't come back.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir there, Dustin.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So on top of course, the stadium move, the draft is a bust that year with Shavar Thomas and Jason Thompson in the first 2 rounds not panning out. Matt and Jordan ran off to Denmark, leaving DJ Countess as the number one goaltender. Brad Davis was a quality addition. I'll give him that one. But the halfway through the season, we get one of the craziest moves I can remember happening. The Burn trade, what is effectively 3 starters at the time, Ryan Suarez, Paul Broom, and Chivas Martinez to the LA Galaxy, who also, by the way, were having a stinker of a season, for Ezra Hendrickson and Gavin Glinton. Now, this trade turns out, in my opinion, to be a complete bust. Glinton plays only 10 games before he gets injury buyout in the offseason, and then Hendrickson plays, I can't remember how, something like 16 games, I think. But his contract's not renewed either. So essentially you traded away 3 young starters for 2 guys that were gone within a couple of months.
And that bad season that LA was having, they were having a really good season from one standpoint. Their stadium situation improved significantly because that's when the whatever they're calling it these days, but it was then the Home Depot Center. That's when it opened. So at least Ryan Suarez and Paul Broom and Chivas Martinez got an immediate upgrade in the facilities. But yeah, I mean at that point the team was just flailing about, just trying to. I mean, it was obvious that they were trying to do something. I mean, obviously, at that point they were quite visibly a really bad team headed for a really bad season. And so it was literally a let's just throw something against the wall and see if it sticks. I mean, sort of situation. And I'm sure that two of those 3 players were, namely Broom and Ryan Suarez. I mean, they had pretty well established reputations as, let's just say hotheads. And so I don't know if this is the case, and you probably know better than I would. I could see that they probably popped off to Mike Jeffries once too often. And
well, Suarez certainly, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I could foresee, I could imagine one of those situations. But yeah, it was they were literally trying to do anything. The thing that amazed me most about that season, and I guess it shouldn't, but it did, is that they fired Mike Jeffries. Not that it was should have been completely unexpected. I mean, when your team is having one of the worst seasons in league history, I think you should expect the coach to be fired. I mean, heck, Real Madrid fires coaches even when they're not running away with the league by a big enough margin. So certainly, it was not unexpected, but I don't know that it was all his fault.
No,
I don't think he helped. I don't think he helped as much as another coach could have, but I think it was certainly it had a fair aroma of scapegoat.
Well, you only have to look at the season before when he made some improvements and had the team moving in a positive direction, and then to have it be as this level of disaster only happens because of the move. But to be fair, when you had a new GM, Greg Elliott was going to want his own guy. So even if it hadn't been if it even just been an okay season, he still might have made a change just because he could have his guy. You know how that is. I mean, his guy ended up being one of the current assistants, but that's Hunt MO, so that's always going to happen. But
yeah. Well, yeah, and so I mean, literally, like I said, you could do an entire podcast episode on how everything that went wrong that season. My most enduring memory as a supporter of that team is number one. I almost got into a fist fight with a good friend of yours and mine, Kevin Lindstrom.
Oh wow!
At the end of one loss at Dragon Stadium, and neither of us actually ended up taking a swing because at the end of the day we're both good friends, and because both of us are he's a lawyer and I'm a software developer. Neither of us is much of a fighter, but we're good friends. Okay, that's one memory. The other memory is that since they did not sell beer at Dragon Stadium, and in fact, the Carroll Independent School District did not allow any sort of alcohol on school grounds, including Dragon Stadium. Any sort of tailgating with an adult beverage that had to be done in this adjacent open field.
I forgot
really
that.
An undeveloped open field. So, of course, it wasn't lit. So after a game, it's 9:30. It's dark in North Texas, and even in the summertime at that point in time. So we're all standing around in the dark after a game, commiserating over yet another loss. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I hope nothing bites me, and I hope I don't trip over anything getting in and out of here with this cooler full of beer. And so when Hunt Sports Group finally concedes defeat after that season and moves back to the Cotton Bowl, I was most gratified. I was probably more gratified about that part of the move than I probably should have been. I probably should have been, yay, we're moving back to a big league stadium, and yay, we're back to one with grass in it. No, I was happy that I would not have to,
perspective,
play Oregon Trail just to get a beer.
Well, speaking of 2000, let's finish 2003. The Burn finished 6-19-5, 23 points. That's terrible. At a staggering 64 goals allowed. 35 goals scored is not great either. That ties for the worst in franchise history. So Jeffries is fired. Colin Clark finishes this season, and the Burn missed the playoffs for the first time in their history.
And let me just put a bow on that by saying it is the worst season in team history, and it is not even close.
Not even close, right?
Not even close. I mean, they've missed the playoffs before. And they would miss. Well, that's right. Since then, they've missed the playoffs a number of years, but nothing on that an amazing scale of abject failure on every single level. I mean,
from my own perspective, Dustin, you would not believe how hard it was to keep riding and covering the team that year.
Oh, I heard the same thing from from Steve Davis.
Yeah,
I asked him about it once, and he said, "No, man, this is the worst."
Yeah,
and
it was difficult.
Yeah, I mean, who wants to go into a locker room and ask a team that's just lost in the umpty ninth game in that season?
Oh, and just going to training was just so abject. There was no hope. They knew that they were terrible, and they just had no hope for turning it around. It was brutal, to be honest. All right, let's move on though. 2003 sucks. 2004, cooler heads prevail. We go back to the Cotton Bowl, as you mentioned, back to the best surface in the league. Colin Clark basically starts a complete overhaul of the side. Ramon Nunez is drafted after his freshman year at SMU. Clarence Goodson is drafted out of Maryland. Tony Mleko, who had been kept around for 2003, gets to play a bit. Eric Quill is added. And then they completely overhaul the defense. Simo Valcalari is brought in as a 6. Scott Garlick and Jeff Cassar split time in goal. Kerry Talley, Steve Jolly, Milton Reyes, and Corey Gibbs all came in. But the one guy in that list that I really want to talk about is for this section of the Burn section is Corey Gibbs. Because I honestly remember, Corey Gibbs in one season is probably the best and classiest and highest level defender this club has seen. I remember him looking around sometimes going, what the hell am I doing playing in this league?
Yeah, and that's the thing about it is that you could look at the guy out there on the field and you could tell that he was just doing this for a paycheck until he moved on to bigger and better things.
Right.
Get me the hell out of here. Yeah, and the irony is a couple of years later he would be back in the league. But he was, and the thing about it is he was here for such a short time that you almost forget about him.
Yeah, you do.
I didn't even when we were doing our ratings of the best defenders, mm-hmm. I had almost forgotten about him until I was reviewing the tapes. Yeah, that's right, Corey Gibbs was here, and and see, the thing about it is he didn't even really have any memorable moments. Like you said that Lubos Kubik was only played 11 games for the Burn.
Right.
That shocked me because if nothing else, I remember the Lubos Kubik time in Dallas for one particular moment, is where he knocked his former teammate Ante Razov into a goalpost when the Burn were playing the Fire, and basically knocked Razov cold. Now, this provided for a lot of banter between Fire fans and Burn fans for a few weeks, and I think the at that point Adidas had an ad campaign where they said "I kiss football."
Oh yeah. I kiss football.
And so the next time the Fire came to Dallas, some of us held up a sign that says "Razov, I kiss goalpost."
I kiss post. Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and but see, that's the thing. I remember that time for Lubos Kubik for doing that, and I don't remember anything about what you said was probably one of the best pure classiest defenders that this team has ever had. Simply because all he was competent.
Yeah, 21 games, but it was a great 21 games.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, the thing I remember most about 2004 was Simo Valcalari.
Yeah.
And because he provided pretty much the spine for what was going to be a really good turnaround. They didn't make the playoffs that year, but in future years they were going to be much better and they were much better that year than they were in 2003, simply because he provided a very good spine there in the middle. He was a pure destroyer, but he did it really well. And
Oscar called him a criminal, if you remember. Yeah, he was a criminal on the field.
Yeah, I remember him doing some criminal things, and I remember him suffering the long arm of the law and having to spend a game or two on the sideline because of it. Colin Clark really improved the spine of the team. As you mentioned the defenders, you mentioned Valcalari. And so they were much better, and they were, if I remember correctly, they were in playoff contention up until the last day of the season, where they had the misfortune of playing the defending champions, San Jose, who were not as good that year as they were the previous
Dallas had more wins than San Jose, actually, even though they finished behind them.
But San Jose did just enough to
more ties. More ties.
Yeah, they tied the game. If I remember, they tied the game and thus made the playoffs at Dallas's expense.
Yeah, 2-2 that game. Actually, you're right.
So they were much better, and so you could see that they were, laying the groundwork for something really big, and everybody knew at that point that, the Burn were going to be moving into their new stadium next year. And so, okay, great, we're building to something.
Yeah, Gibbs was an all-star. Jason Kreis was the commissioner's pick. I don't know if you remember that. But really, Ronnie O'Brien probably had the best season for the Burn that year because he was an all-star and MLS Best 11 with 2 goals and 10 assists. I until I was looking this stuff up, I'd forgotten that Ronnie was a Best 11 that season.
Well, what I remember about Ronnie O'Brien is, like you is, I remember. I don't remember Ronnie O'Brien in the statistical terms. I just remember him in broad terms. Like, he was I think probably one of this team's more underappreciated offensive threats.
Definitely the best pure crosser, I would say.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I saw that. MLSsoccer.com the other day said that Ryan Hollingshead is the best crosser in the league right now, which great for Ryan Hollingshead, but I was like, wow, I don't even think this guy is anywhere as close to as good a one as Ronnie O'Brien was.
Right.
But great. It was like Ronnie O'Brien, and like I said before, his injury at the beginning of the 2003 season pretty much set the stage for that. How badly the team played that year.
Yep. Well, one other player I think we have to talk about in 2004, and because we can't get away without talking about him at all, is the guy that led the team in scoring that year. And I'll give you a chance to guess who led the Burn in scoring in 2004.
2004, God.
Don't look it up. See if you can guess.
I'm not gonna look at. This should be dead easy for me.
You think
and
it
wasn't
be?
Christ? Yeah, it wasn't Christ.
Well, not just to save airtime, I'll tell you the answer. The answer is Eddie Johnson. 12 goals in 2004.
Well, that's the thing is Eddie Johnson had already been with the team for a few years by that point.
He had been, yes.
But he had just not turned it on. And the first I remember of Eddie Johnson really doing something was the 2005 season because, you'll get to it in a future episode.
Yeah, different episode.
Different episode. But, he and Carlos Ruiz were, great 1-2 punch the next year. But that's the first time. I didn't realize that Eddie Johnson had actually scored that many goals that year.
Well, he was drafted at the age of 17, you remember, only, 2 years or so, maybe 3 years before that. So, he's barely 20-ish at that point. But he was a grown-ass man by that point, if you remember that story.
Yeah, because he didn't play video games.
Right. Oh, yeah. So, you have to give Eddie some credit for starting to come on as part of, as you said, we all felt like at the end of 2004 that this is a team moving in the right direction, that it was a team doing positive things.
Yeah, and, and this is... And I know that you're going to be doing the rankings of coaches here later on.
Later in the summer, yeah.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people underappreciate
for sure
Colin Clark and what he did with this team simply because of who came before and who came later. Dave Durr, he built the team. Oscar Perea, he won silverware with the two trophies with the team, and so that sort of and then Sheldon Heineman actually took the team to MLS Cup when he was coach, and so Colin Clark I think gets overshadowed a little bit because of that, because every other coach, those 3 other coaches all have something you could point to, but Colin Clark, after the Burn fired him a few years later, he went on to become a pretty good coach in USL, in the USL championship or whatever they were calling it that season when he was coaching Carolina, I think he did, and I think he also coached Puerto Rico.
I remember the Puerto Rico Islanders run to like the semifinal of the Champions League.
Yeah,
the CONCACAF Champions League.
Yeah, and he was,
and
I think he was probably a coach that was, whose firing you could probably say was a bit unjustified.
Well, I definitely would say that, but we'll get into that on a later pod because that's FC Dallas era.
Yeah, I know. I'm only here for the Burn stuff. Yeah.
Well, we're already going 2 hours, Dustin. We only have so much time.
Oh yeah, I know. I could talk this all day.
Yeah. Well, speaking of 2004, I don't remember any particularly landmark wins, but they did have a 5-1 win over DC United that was, of course, lovely, and then they stomped Chicago 4-1. Those are two of the better wins that season. Coming towards the second half as the team was progressing, and we started to see growth in it as the team was improving.
Yeah. And, like I said, 2004 was what it was. There wasn't any really, there weren't the sort of signature season-defining moments that you saw in other seasons. But what it was a season in which they were building to something.
Yeah.
It was one of those building seasons.
Well, the last thing, Dustin, we're going to talk about after the Burn failed to make the playoffs in 2004 for their second time. But that leads us to the end of the Burn era. But before we let you go, I want to hear your take on the rebrand, the change of Dallas Burn to FC Dallas. First, did you think that a rebrand was something that should have been on the cards? And then, second, what did you think of the execution of the rebrand?
Well, one thing you got to know is that I'm not much of a marketing guy, so my views of rebrands are, it's the same stuff in a different package. So do I think a rebrand was necessary? You're always going to hear from me, probably not. But if you ask somebody who actually knows something about these things, you might get a different response. Now, how was it executed? What I always say about the rebrand is that they swapped out a really crummy name for a different kind of crummy name, which is to say that I have never been a fan of the name FC Dallas. First of all, it's utterly generic.
Yep.
It does not evoke anything in anybody. It's just, it reminds me, remember in the CFL when the Baltimore team, they tried using Colts for a while, and the NFL said, so I think for a time they were just the Baltimore Football Club.
I don't remember that, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, but it's always like calling something football club or soccer club or baseball club is always it seems like a placeholder. It's like until you get like a real nickname.
Right.
And so I was like, FC Dallas, oh, how generic. And then you're calling yourself Football Club Dallas in a town where another team is probably the biggest name in what Americans know as football.
Yeah.
That's another strike against it. And then, what seems so crazy to me is that the Hunts, back then, they owned, and they still do own, Dallas Tornado.
Yep.
And given that NASL names before with the Earthquakes and after with the Sounders and the Timbers and the Whitecaps were all the rage, why not just use a name that you already own, that people around town know? The copy almost writes itself. The triumphant return of the Dallas Tornado.
Yeah.
They compound it. Now, I know you like the hoops.
That was my idea.
Oh, it was your idea?
Yeah.
So do I get to blame you for the fact that I hate them?
Peter blames me for it all the time, yeah.
Oh, God. I never really liked looking like Waldo when I was wearing a t-shirt.
Oh, no. Execution of the red and white hoops was not my fault. I said red and blue with white shorts, or at the time, actually, when I first suggested it, they were still red and black. And I said, like Flamingo, red and black hoops with white shorts like Flamingo.
Okay,
I'll suggestion.
Okay, I'll concede that point.
Yeah.
But I don't think, I've never, okay, I'll put it this way. I was never a fan of the red and white hoops. I didn't like looking like a candy cane or like Waldo or like a barber pole or anything else you can say about that particular design pattern. And I've never been so happy in the last decade since they stepped away from doing that and then first going to a almost entirely red shirt
Ugh.
and then finally into last year to the last couple of years to the deconstructed Texas flag.
I hate that thing.
And now to what they're wearing, the hoopish kind of thing that they're wearing in 2020.
I like that.
If we ever see them, I like it too. But
yeah.
I don't.
Closer to what I suggested.
At this point, the team was the Dallas Burn for 9 seasons, and they've been FC Dallas for 16. So they are SC Dallas. The Burn are long gone. If I were had if I had Jeff Bezos kind of money tomorrow and I could buy FC Dallas, I wouldn't rebrand them because why should I? I mean,
yeah.
They have spent more time as FC Dallas than any other team has spent as something other than I think the sidekicks.
Well, the one saving grace I said of the name at the time was right now it seems a little boring. But if you want to talk about like 100 years of a franchise, it'll be perfectly fine. Once everyone's used to it, it's no big deal.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, it is what it is. It is not what I would have chosen, but and I think it is kind of a crummy name, but it's not like, I have this like huge nostalgia for the old name.
All right, Dustin, that's now an hour and a half of our part 2 of our Dallas Burn era historic walkthrough. It's been fantastic, my friend. Any final thought to wrap up the Dallas Burn era?
Oh man, I think a lot of people, and this is just me being get off my lawn. I think a lot of people sort of, and I might also include Hunt Sports Group in this category, kind of view the Burn era as quote unquote the before times. Like one of my friends on the internet who supports the Red Bulls and who supported the Metro Stars way back then, tells me that Red Bull goes out of its way to pretend like the Metro Stars didn't exist publicly.
That.
Yeah, and so the Hunts don't quite do that, but when this team, and I'm glad that they're doing something for the 25th anniversary.
Yes.
I wish that sort of thing had been there for the 20th anniversary, because 20 years, when this team turned 20 years old, it was a phenomenal milestone for any soccer team in this country. And I'm glad, but it seems I think over the years of Hunt Sports Group ownership, it seems like things that happened before 2005, kind of don't really exist unless they want to say, oh yeah, we won the Open Cup in '97, and oh no, we won it again. But I don't think. I think they kind of. I think for a time they threw those days down the memory hole. I'm glad that they've been inviting Mark Dodd back and Dave Durr back, and I suppose eventually we're going to see Jason Christ scarfing the statue, which is kind of, which would be great, because he, before anyone else, was the face of this team, and he is still on the Mount Rushmore for this team.
Yep. They need to make some fences there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and they seem to, be all too happy to ship him off to Salt Lake right before they were opening the new stadium, which he helped make possible. I mean, he gave people a reason to come out to the stadium, every week when he was, scoring all those goals and being the face of the franchise, for all those years. And, I don't want to go so far as to say that that Toyota Stadium is the stadium that Jason Christ built, but he was certainly someone that fans would turn out to see. And when they were a league-run team struggling for any sort of visibility they could get, he provided some of that for them. And so I'm glad that they're finally acknowledging this team's, I think, rich history. I mean, does this team have the same history of silverware as the Galaxy or DC United or the Fire? No. But they're, or even, say, for example, Sporting Kansas City. But they're not that far behind. I mean, certainly I would put the accomplishments of the Dallas Burn above any of the 9 remaining 96 teams other than DC and LA. Even above San Jose. I mean, San Jose won 2 MLS Cups and a Supporter Shield, and I would still put what the Burn accomplished, in those 9 years above what the Earthquakes did.
Back then, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Dustin, I couldn't agree more. It's been a fantastic romp through the Dallas Burn history. My man, I appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners appreciate it. Thanks for coming on and chatting with us.
Hey, thanks for letting me ramble on.
It's been fantastic.
I can be a little bit loquacious at times, and I appreciate your indulging me.
Well, it's okay. It's been fantastic stuff. I know a great part of our fan base knows nothing about the early days of the team, and hopefully between you and myself and some of the other old guys, we can remedy some of that.
All right. Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast, part 2, and hopefully you enjoyed part 1. If you did, or if you like any of the work we do on our website or any of this stuff, be sure and support us if you feel like it's worth it at patreon.com/Third Degree. Thanks again, Dustin, for coming on this version of Third Degree, the podcast, as we romp through the history of the Dallas Burn. Hopefully everybody enjoyed it and joins us next time as we start into the FC Dallas history section of the franchise. And stay tuned to see who our mystery guests will be to help us with that part. So long.